Hi there, my name is Hazel and I'm a researcher at the University of Aberdeen. My work focuses on understanding the role of blood vessels in diseases that affect the brain and the spinal cord, including different forms of motor neuron disease. So as you don't think of me as a complete stranger, let me first tell you a little bit about myself. So, although I work in Aberdeen, as you can probably tell from the accent, I don't come from here, I'm actually from Glasgow. And after the school, I studied human anatomy at the University of Glasgow. And during that time, I had the chance to travel. And I went to Helsinki where I studied Parkinson's disease, and then went to Aberdeen to work on motor neuron disease. And that's where I really found my passion for research. So I enjoyed it so much that I came back to Aberdeen to do my PhD, which I completed in 2023. And since then, I've continued my work as a postdoctoral research fellow, working on a childhood form of MND called spinal muscular atrophy. So the type of work I do is called preclinical research, and that means that I'm not working directly with patients, but instead I'm working in the lab, trying to understand the basic biology of these diseases. So that fundamental knowledge is then what others can later build on to develop new treatments. For the past few years, I've been particularly interested in blood vessels, and you might be thinking, what on earth do blood vessels have to do with motor neuron disease? Because when we think about MND, we naturally think about motor neurons, and they are situated in the brain and spinal cord, and when they're lost, it causes the progressive weakness of muscles that we see in the condition. But for motor neurons to stay alive and healthy, they rely on a support system. And one of the most important part of this support system is a network of blood vessels. So research now shows that blood vessels may play a key role in the progression of not just MND, but also of other neurodegenerative diseases. And that shapes both how severe they become and also how quickly they progress. So my research is focused on uncovering how blood vessels change in diseases like MND. And the key question is whether these changes are just a byproduct of disease or whether they're actually actively contributing to it. And if they are, then protecting or repairing them could open up new opportunities for treatment. So today I want to share with you a couple of things. The first is how blood vessels might play a role in MND. Next, it will be what my research is beginning to reveal, and then finally how a related condition, spinal muscular atrophy, gives us real hope that progress is possible. So first of all, what do blood vessels actually do? So they are a very long collection of tubes which act as roads or motorways to different parts of the body. They deliver oxygen and nutrients to all of the body's cells. They remove waste products that cells produce, and they form selective and protective barriers. And by carrying out these functions, they are absolutely crucial to every organ system. And really, I could go on and on all day about the different roles they play in each. But we're here to focus on the brain and the spinal cord, which is the location of our motor neurons. So the brain and spinal cord are supplied by this dense network of blood vessels, and you can just see in this image here, this is the spinal cord and all of the blood vessels that supply it. So as well as delivering oxygen and nutrients, they also form a protective barrier, and that's called the blood-brain barrier. So this blood-brain barrier is made up of several layers, and essentially it acts like airport security, and it's carefully checking what comes into the brain and spinal cord from the blood and out from the brain and spinal cord to the blood. So in healthy conditions, only certain substances are allowed through, and that keeps harmful substances that are in the blood away from the brain and spinal cord and away from the sensitive motor neurons. But when these blood vessels are damaged, we can have quite a lot of consequences from that. So if the blood vessels are lost and the blood flow is reduced, the motor neurons may not receive enough energy to function properly. And if this specialist blood-brain barrier is damaged, then it can become leaky, and that allows blood to flow out from the blood vessel into the brain and spinal cord, and it exposes motor neurons to those harmful substances that are in the blood. So research has now shown that in neurodegenerative diseases, blood vessels don't always function as they should. And because all the components of the brain and the spinal cord function as a single unit, and that's what this diagram here illustrates, it means that damage to one can have knock-on effects to others. So scientists have found that in neurodegenerative diseases, there is a reduced blood supply to the brain and spinal cord. There is abnormal growth and repair of blood vessels, and there's also leaks in the barrier, that blood-brain barrier, and that lets harmful substances cross into the brain. So on their own, these changes don't cause the disease, but what they do is they act like pouring fuel onto a fire that's already burning. And that is why it's so important that we don't just study motor neurons on their own, but we also study the environment that surrounds them. So as I mentioned earlier, my own work focuses mainly on spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA. And what most people don't know is that ALS is not the only form of motor neuron disease, but instead motor neuron disease is a kind of umbrella term which encompasses a lot of diseases, including SMA. So SMA mostly affects children, and symptoms usually appear before 6 months of age. But like ALS, SMA leads to the loss of motor neurons, and this breaks the connection between the brain, where the thought of movement begins, and the muscles which actually carry out that movement. Unfortunately, without treatment, SMA is usually fatal by about the age of 2 years old. But the crucial difference is that we know exactly what causes SMA. It's a fault in a single gene. And that knowledge has allowed scientists to develop effective therapies. And this is such a success story, and one that I'm going to come back to later on. So a little bit about the research that I actually do now. So my current work and what I've been doing for the last few years is trying to understand how blood vessels are affected in SMA. So specifically, I study endothelial cells. So these are the cells that line the inside of the blood vessel. And you can just see in this diagram here, the kind of mosaic pattern that's on the inside of that vessel, and those are the endothelial cells. So what they do is they act like gatekeepers of this blood vessel and of this blood-brain barrier. So in the lab, I use both post-mortem tissue and disease models to study how blood vessels and individual endothelial cells change and behave in SMA. So in post-mortem tissue, we look at things like changes in number and shape and structure of entire blood vessels. We look at changes in shape and structure of the individual endothelial cells, and also of the other components that make up that protective blood-brain barrier. And we also look for evidence of leakage of blood through the blood-brain barrier and into the brain and the spinal cord. So my research in the last couple of years has shown that blood vessels in SMA look very different to blood vessels from healthy individuals. So these images here are the spinal cord down a microscope, and what we have is the blood vessels that we can see. So the one on the left-hand side is a healthy, and what we can see is there's definite blood vessels there, and they've got a really strong structure. But then on the right-hand side, we have the SMA blood vessels, and unfortunately, they're small and abnormal. So when we go to look at the cells that make up the blood vessels more closely, what we can tell is they are also unhealthy. So if we think about a blood vessel as a tube, and we cut down the center of the tube, and we turn it round to look down through it, this is what we would see. This here is our blood vessel with our blood inside and our endothelial cells surrounding. And what we can see, which are images from the spinal cord of a healthy individual and someone with SMA, is that in the pink here is the part of the blood vessel where the blood flows through, and the yellow is the endothelial cells which line the blood vessels. So on the left-hand side, this is a healthy blood vessel and a healthy endothelial cell, but you can see on the right-hand side, this SMA one has swellings that look almost like bubbles inside the cell. And this tells us that that is an unhealthy endothelial cell. So we can see that overall, the blood vessels in SMA are they just don't appear healthy or happy. And this could actually affect how much blood and therefore oxygen and nutrients reaches the brain and the spinal cord, which just makes a very stressful environment, which could influence motor neuron loss. So we also see that the layers of this protective barrier are damaged, and this allows blood to leak out from the inside of the blood vessel and into the spinal cord. On the left here, this image shows our healthy blood vessel. So it's this kind of long streak here, and the blood is the brown inside. So this is our healthy, and this is the way it's supposed to look. However, in SMA, what we see is this collection of blood around the outside of the blood vessel, and that shows that the blood is leaking out from inside and it's mixing with the cells of the spinal cord, which are labelled here in blue. So this is just really not good for the cells, and it makes a toxic environment. And since motor neurons are especially vulnerable to substances in the blood, this could cause them further harm. So looking at post-mortem tissue gives us a picture of the end result, but to actually understand how these changes develop in patients, we need to turn to disease models. So at the moment, I'm working with endothelial cells, which we grow in a dish in the lab, and this is them in this picture here that you can see. So we can introduce the genetic changes that cause SMA, and then we can study how these cells behave and function as they try to form a blood vessel. And so far we've learned that in SMA, endothelial cells struggle to move, they struggle to multiply, and they struggle to grow into tubes, which are all essential steps in building a healthy blood vessel network. Now, importantly, these blood vessel and endothelial cell changes are not just unique to SMA, but we're actually seeing similar problems in other neurodegenerative diseases, including in ALS. So the idea is to study SMA in depth, and then we can apply those insights more widely. Because if we can understand what's going wrong with blood vessels, we may find ways to strengthen them. And in turn, that would give motor neurons a much better chance of survival. So just a few years ago, SMA was considered untreatable and a devastating disease. But now, thanks to breakthroughs in research, there are 3 effective therapies which are transforming lives. These 3 statements at the top here are newspaper headlines from the last couple of years, and they are just such a delight to see in this field of research. So in SMA, this progress was made easier because we know the exact cause of the disease. It's one gene, which means one protein, which means one target. And in ALS, the situation is unfortunately much more complex because in many cases, we don't know the cause of the disease. But if anything, SMA proves something incredibly important. It proves that even in devastating conditions like these, science can deliver breakthroughs. And it gives us real hope that with the right research that we can find therapies for adult forms of motor neuron disease too. So where do we go from here? For me, the key questions are, can we identify how exactly blood vessels contribute to MND? Can we target those changes with therapies? Could protecting blood vessels slow down or even prevent motor neuron loss? And are similar changes observed in other neurodegenerative conditions? So research into blood vessels in MND is still relatively new, but we are learning fast. And with the example of SMA, we know that what seems impossible today can be transformed tomorrow. So to finish, I'd just like to leave you with one final key thought, is that blood vessels aren't just bystanders in MND, but they could be active players in disease progression. And if we can protect them, we may be able to also protect motor neurons too. And thanks to the success story of SMA, we do know that treatments for MND are possible. So with continued research and collaboration, then there's real reason for hope. So I'd just like to say thank you to all the donors and their families, because this study wouldn't have been possible without them. To all the members of the Parson Lab, our collaborators and our funders, and thank you to you for listening. Thank you.